The Australian social researcher Hugh Mackay once gave a reflection on how difficult it is to get other people to hear what we're trying to say. As he observed, how many times have we said in frustration, if I've told them once, I've told them 100 times. It just seems to go in one ear and out the other. As Mackay says, what we may be really saying, of course, is, guess what? I know a message that never works. It doesn't seem to matter how often I say it. It never has any effect on the people I'm talking to, but I don't give up easily. It's such a good message that I'm determined to get it into their heads. So I keep on trying. 50 times, 60 times, 100 times. No worries. Sooner or later, it will get through. Well, the logic operating in this is that communication is essentially about saying what we want to say, and that our message has some kind of innate power which, if unleashed in the minds of another, will cause an amazing transformation to take place. Once they've heard what I have to say, people will think what I want them to think. They'll believe what I want them to believe. And of course, most importantly, they will do what I want them to do. Mackay points out, though, that this is communication by injection. It's based on the assumption that messages put meaning and ideas into another person's mind. Whereas what usually happens, of course, is precisely the opposite. People put their own meaning onto messages based on the ideas which are already in their minds. There is then a law of communication which runs like this. It's not what our message does to the other person, but what the other person does with our message that in the end determines whether or not we'll communicate with one another. The really powerful part of the communication process is not the message itself then, but the mind of the person on the receiving end, the one who can accept or reject what is said and make it mean what he or she wants it to mean. This is why two people will give very different accounts of a meeting that they've both attended, or of a film they've both seen, or indeed of a sermon they've both heard. One of the hardest lessons to learn about communication is that other people are generally not in an eager state of anticipation to hear what we're going to say. Most of us, of course, are more interested in what we think than in what anyone else thinks. And it's much easier to defend our own ideas than to entertain the ideas of another person, which of course always carries the risk that we might have to change our mind if we truly hear what they want to say. Not listening is far more comfortable than listening. Listening is a dangerous, courageous business, which is why we're good at avoiding it. Because it means that in order to truly listen, we have to empty ourselves in order to receive something, putting aside our own ideas, yes, and even our own fears. God wishes to communicate with us, and God's communication is in many forms all around us. But that message, like others, is not in some form that simply injects into our minds. God's message, like others, in order to be truly heard, means we have to listen. And as we've said, listening is not easy. It's one of the hardest things for us to do. It means that we will need to stop. It means that we will have to give time. It means that we will have to ask questions to get to the full meaning of the message. It means that we will have to let go, for a while at least, of our own resistances. Yet when we do listen, the outcome can be truly surprising. This then brings us to the parable that we've heard in the Gospel this Sunday. We're well used to placing the focus of interpretation on the soil. We identify with one type of soil or another. But let's also focus on the beginning and the end of the parable, since the beginning and the end of this parable are what gives it its particular edge. The parable begins with the sower and ends with the yield. For anyone broadcasting seed in first century Palestine, the actions of the sower are quite unusual. He's broadcasting the seed everywhere. There is a recklessness, almost a carelessness about his sowing. The seed was not cheap in ancient Palestine. A wise sower then would be very careful as to where the seed landed. He would not want to waste any of it. But in the parable, God, the divine sower, seems not so wise. There's a lavishness, a carefreeness in his action. God sows everywhere, yes, even in those places which at first seem most unlikely to be able to yield. There's no great discrimination that occurs in the mind of God, the sower. There is seed in abundance. He is not miserly, counting the cost. There's plenty to go around. It's the very carefreeness and generosity of God that in the end is what yields the abundant harvest at the end of the sowing, at the end of the parable. Generosity begets generosity. Much is given, much shared. The generosity of the sower at the beginning of the parable is linked then to the generosity of the yield at the end of the parable. In ancient Palestine, it was a yield of 2 to 8% was considered very good. But here Jesus is talking about 30, 60, 100-fold. It's unheard of to a Palestinian farmer. Jesus is suggesting that, mirroring the generosity of the sower, a ready field will yield more than what could ever be imagined. And the field that is ready is the heart that is truly seeking to listen. Do we dare to listen to God's communication? It means that we may need to change. Do we really want to?